The men were scared by the coward Reno and acted accordingly. Dan Neely, who now lives in Gilt Edge, Montana, and has been known as Cracker Box Dan all these years, hid behind a cracker box during the fight. Captain Miles Moreland, who I heard was buried in Los Angeles a while ago, was known as Aparejo Mickey because he spent the entire time hiding behind an aparejo. Then there was young Billy Blake, a private. For 2 days up there, he pretended to be wounded and stayed with the injured to avoid fighting, even though he wasn't hurt at all. After it was over and he came to his senses, poor Billy was ashamed of himself. He couldn't handle the teasing from the rest of us, so he got transferred to another company. Now Billy, Crackerbox Dan, and Moreland were naturally brave men and good soldiers. However, the skirmish they went through down below with Reno, who was out of his mind with fear, yelling orders they couldn't hear, and the panicky retreat up the hill kind of made them lose it for a while. They were like riderless horses in a fire. Bud, I kept thinking to myself, where was Custer as I toiled in the searing sun, firing down at the Indians and dragging dead horses to create breastworks? The men working with me kept asking, "What do you suppose happened to Custer?" Some of them speculated that maybe he'd joined Terry, but most of us knew better. We knew he wouldn't abandon us because that wasn't his way. Along with the heat and the constant craving for water, we were all worried about Custer. At first, while we were working early on the 25th, we saw a lot of smoke and dust across the other ridge. It wasn't far away, Bud. Around that time, most of the Indians left us and headed in that direction. If we'd followed them, if we'd attacked their rear instead of letting them bunch up against Custer, maybe he'd be alive today. But we didn't. We stayed hidden behind the rifle pits. We heard some shots fired from over there. Someone spoke up, laughed, and said, "Reckon Custer's giving the Red Devils hell." We kept listening. We heard a volley fired, and then, after a minute, another. Folks now figure that was Custer's signal of distress, his last call for us to come to him. If we'd just walked a little ways just up to the next ridge, we could have seen down onto Custer Hill. But we didn't. After a while, there were no more shots from over there, and the smoke cleared away and the dust settled. I don't know if I can tell things in proper order, Bud. It's been a long time, and even then, with the firing, the heat, the torment for water, our worrying about Custer, and the yelling, shooting, and riding Indians below, we were confused. But pretty soon, Wallace came back up the hill and he was beaten. Not many of his men were left with him. The rest had been killed down in the brush, trying to get through to Custer. But those men weren't to be pitied. They died like soldiers. I'd rather be one of them than live on branded a coward. Don't get me wrong, Bud. We weren't all cowards. That day, a lot of bravery was displayed. Some men volunteered to go down right into the face of Indian fire to rescue the wounded scattered along the side of the cliff. We were all craving water, and the wounded suffered the most. Dr. Porter, he was a good and brave man, worked tirelessly to ease their suffering. With the heat, blood poisoning set in quickly. I remember one time in particular when he amputated a man's leg. I saw that man lying there, his face as white as a sheet, his lips tight, not a moan out of him. Only his eyes showed the pain. Dr. Porter said, "My wounded need water. Who'll volunteer to go get it?" Bud, there was the river just below us, millions of gallons of water rippling and sparkling along, but between us and it were the Indians, shooting anyone who made a move toward it. From our hill down a deep valley that men could crawl through almost to the river. Beyond that was a narrow strip of open ground, and rushing across it to the water meant certain death. Our thirst became unbearable. We sucked on raw potatoes and held pebbles in our mouths, but nothing helped much. All of us, horses and men, would have sold our souls for a drink of that water we could see flowing along. The wounded, of course, were in the worst condition. When Dr. Porter spoke up, some men volunteered and crept down the ravine carrying buckets, kettles, and canteens. I started with them. My horse got hit in the flank, and I came back, figuring I'd just as soon die of thirst as from an Indian bullet. Some of them made it. One fellow was hit just as he stooped over to fill his bucket. The pail was shot away, and his leg was shattered. Gripping another man's stirrup, he was hauled back up the slope. Later, that leg had to be amputated. Most of those who went down brought back a little water, just enough for the doctor to trickle into the mouths of the wounded. After that, from time to time, men kept slipping down through the ravine to the river, but I didn't try it again. I saw Dandy get shot in the neck. I don't remember who was riding him. I saw him fall. He was a pretty little horse, dark brown. He never could stand having any other horse ahead of him. Custer had gotten him in '68, and I thought, the general will feel pretty bad when I tell him Dandy was killed. I remembered him saying just as we left Fort Lincoln that he'd need to get another horse because Dandy was starting to show his age a bit. He lay there, just like he was sleeping, and I thought of all the good times he and Custer had had galloping like crazy across the plains. Tears came to my eyes as I stroked his neck. Then he opened his eyes, and they were big, soft, and full of suffering. He gave a little nicker. I knew he was begging for water. He was wondering why I wasn't taking care of him like always. Well, the long, hot day dragged on. It felt like a year up there, not knowing where Custer was and not knowing when the Indians might charge us from the rear where there were no cliffs for protection. Looking back on it now, Bud, it all seems like a bad dream, like it couldn't have happened. And I start thinking, maybe it is a dream. Maybe after a while, I'll wake up and I won't be old. I'll be back with the 7th tending Bloosh and Tuck and Vic and Dandy. Miss Libby will be there and the general will be around, laughing, joking, wearing his big white hat like always. But the bad dream won't ever end, I know, until I get the guts to end it. Throughout the 25th and 26th, while the Indians below were firing up at us, there was a fellow on a hill overlooking ours who kept taking shots at us with a long-range buffalo gun. He was a good shot. We couldn't see him, but every time his gun went off, one of our men, horses, or mules would go down. That Indian caused us more trouble than the entire group below. Eventually, Captain Ryan managed to take him out with a long-range rifle. As the first day wore on the 25th, the smoke cleared a bit in the valley, and most of the Indians started thinning out, heading back to their village for a rest and to mourn their dead. They left just enough warriors around to keep us up there on the hill. None of us had eaten since leaving camp with Custer early that day. We chewed on hardtack and raw bacon, but the food felt like straw scratching down our dry throats without any water. We were all pretty much exhausted. Many of the men just dropped where they stood and fell asleep, too tired to care what happened next. I was one of those detailed to do night guard duty. I had to guard Reno's tent. He had a keg in there, and he was drinking quite a bit. Though I was unable to see inside, I could hear. Once, as I was marching past, I heard him say to another officer who was with him, "Well," he said, "I wonder where the Murat of the American Army is by this time." And then I heard them both laugh. Though I was never sure what Murat meant, I knew he was talking about Custer and that his chuckle had a sneer to it. It was dark. I kept on marching back and forth in front of his tent. Here and there on the ground were patches where men were stretched out, sleeping, and there were other dark patches, bodies of dead horses and dead men. It got awfully quiet. Down in the valley where all day there had been fire and smoke, screaming horses, yelling Indians, it was dark and still. From far away came the beat of tom-toms and the wailing of Indians mourning for their dead. No other sound except the rustle of cottonwoods and the swish of the river. I would occasionally pause my backtracking to listen, believing that I heard muffled voices and the sound of hooves crunching. I would then speculate that Custer and his men might be approaching us from behind the shadows. I kept straining my eyes across toward the ridge where he'd last been seen, and it seemed like my whole body ached just to know where he was. But all night nothing happened, and eventually morning broke.